House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We are here today to talk about C-8, of course, and this is not long before we are actually going to be presented with the next budget. So I think it's very important that Canadians evaluate the past performance of the NDP Liberal coalition before deciding to even consider approving the next budget. And I want to start by saying, Mr. Speaker, that my colleagues and I here in the official opposition have been very positive in our spirit of collaboration in the last couple of years as we've gone through this difficult time of the pandemic. But we also certainly, Mr. Speaker, have our limits as individuals, and groups must have their limits in terms of what they are willing to accept. So I look at the beginning of the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, when we passed in November of 2021 C2, the first COVID relief package worth $37 billion, certainly a lot of funding there. We went on to pass other legislation in this House with significant price tags, including C3, which went through my Committee of HUMA. That was a $7 billion price tag, Mr. Speaker. In December of 2021, we also had C-8, which we're debating here today, with additional spending of $71.2 billion. I mean, these are not small amounts, Mr. Speaker. So I will say, Mr. Speaker, that we certainly have done what was necessary throughout the pandemic. Everyone in this House, certainly on this side of the House, supports Canadians, wants to see Canadians get the help that they need. But it's certainly become incredibly excessive and even growing, perhaps, with this new NDP coalition. And we have to be worried about the items that we're seeing in the new NDP Liberal coalition, which will cost billions upon billions of extra dollars, potentially. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, that we saw this House helping Canadians, eventually leading to overspending even beyond what was necessary, we go further back than that, Mr. Speaker, to something I brought up today in question period, the destruction of the natural resources sector. And this is something that didn't start 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. This started 7 years ago when we saw the initial election of the NDP Liberal coalition government, which continues to play out today. We saw in November of 2016 when the Northern Gateway pipeline was rejected by this coalition to start. We look to October of 2017 when TransCanada cancelled the Energy East pipeline project as a result of pressure from this coalition. And you know, Mr. Speaker, this is something that this NDP Liberal coalition likes to do. They create impossible environments for industry whereby industry has no other choice but to abandon these projects. And then the NDP Liberal coalition says, oh, look, not our fault. This was abandoned by industry, when they have made conditions impossible to complete these projects, to complete these projects, Mr. Speaker. We can't forget, Mr. Speaker, in January of 2017, when the Prime Minister said he wanted to phase out the oil sands, he said, you can't make a choice between what's good for the environment and what's good for the economy. We can't shut down the oil sands tomorrow. We need to phase them out. We need to manage the transition off of our dependence of fossil fuels. So right there, Mr. Speaker, we see the Prime Minister had committed to his continued path of destroying the natural resource sector with the help of the NDP Liberal coalition. This, of course, Mr. Speaker, led to, in April of 2018, when Kinder Morgan halted Trans Mountain pipeline expansion because of continued actions in opposition to the project. So not surprising, Mr. Speaker. In May of 2018, we saw the NDP Liberal Coalition buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline for $4.5 billion, but again, created impossible conditions in which this project could be completed, whereby Kinder Morgan eventually abandoned the project again. So once again, they create impossible conditions for this industry. Of course, I can't help but mention C-48, the oil tanker moratorium, and of course C-69, which was passed both in June of 2019, which completely destroyed that sector, and which we often refer to as the No More Pipelines bill. So, Mr. Speaker, I find it very rich that I hold in my hand here a Canadian Press article from March 20th of 2020, which indicates that Liberals may find extra spending room in the budget created by rising oil prices. That's right. It is reported that it's a position similar to the one Liberals found themselves last December when a rosier economic picture gave the government $38.5 billion in extra spending room, Mr. Speaker. But guess what? The NDP Liberal government quickly ate it up, $28.4 billion. They ate that up with new expenditures, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, this extra funding as a result of the natural resources sector could be up to $5 billion. But we know, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP Liberal government will eat this up in a moment, but before spending even more than that. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the former parliamentary budgetary officer, Kevin Page, said it would be a policy mistake for the government to assume that the higher than anticipated inflation will create extra fiscal room, which could be used to deficit finance long-term programs, many of which we are seeing in the new NDP Liberal coalition. So very interesting there. So we see, Mr. Speaker, that this government, they have a habit of any money that you give them, they will just go and spend. They will not pay down the record debt, the record deficit. They will go and spend it. So why should we trust them in giving them more money? Why should we not look at even this upcoming budget with scrupulation and hesitancy? But more insulting than spending what they don't have, Mr. Speaker, and spending it on the backs of the industry, on the back of the industry, which they have destroyed entirely. Now it was announced yesterday, Mr. Speaker, that they plan to boost oil exports 5% in an effort to ease the energy supply crisis. And this was an announcement that the Minister of the Environment, Natural Resources made yesterday, following the second day of meetings on the International Energy Agency's annual ministerial gathering in Paris. He said Canadian industry has the pipeline and production capacity to incrementally increase oil and gas exports this year by 300,000 barrels per day, comprising 200,000 barrels of oil and 100,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day in natural gas. Well, the Alberta Natural Resources Minister had a response to that. She said, we can get increased production if we can get more infrastructure built. And I think that's what's missing in the conversation, she said. It's not really ambitious to talk about a short-term potential of 200,000 barrels when we sit on top of the third largest oil reserves in the entire world. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we've seen a labor shortage. This NDP Liberal government fired hundreds of thousands of workers when they set out to destroy the natural resources sector, Mr. Speaker. So they have been struggling, this sector has been struggling with the lack of workers since last year, according to a Canadian Press story, when rebounding oil prices first spurred an uptick in drilling activity in the Canadian oil patch. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we have tried on this side of the House to work with the NDP Liberal coalition. They have shown they cannot handle funds responsibly time and time again. Now they turn to the industry they destroyed. Now they decide that it's time to step up, given that Ukrainians are suffering, Europe is suffering, while Canadians have suffered for a long time under this coalition, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. Mr. Speaker, you know, I listened to the Conservatives speak on Bill C-8, and I'm wondering if, in fact, they've actually read the bill or they have a sense in terms of what the bill's actually talking about. What we do know is that the Conservatives are voting against the bill. It's not the first time where they don't support legislation that is there to support Canadians. So, for example, this bill ensures proper school ventilation. It ensures the acquisition of rapid tests. It puts into place that 1% annual tax on foreign ownership of properties, which is hopefully will help drive down some of the speculation and costs of housing in Canada. Can the member explain to me why does she oppose those 3 points, those 3 policy initiatives, given that that's actually what we're supposed to be debating today?
The Calgary.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mid-Nepal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for the question.
You know, I think we have demonstrated, as I indicated in my speech, that we have supported legislation in moments of crisis when it was absolutely necessary for Canadians. What we won't do is give the NDP Liberal coalition a blank check. We will not do that. We are responsible to Canadians to watch the spending of the NDP Liberal coalition. And if this member is so passionate about legislation that helps Canadians, then why did his government put forward C-69 and C-48 that hurt so many Canadians, Mr. Speaker?
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, the speech by my colleague from Calgary Mindapore dealt with the issue of how do we finance these expenditures. And one of those ways, obviously, is the preferred way of the NDP Liberal coalition, which is to borrow money and burden future taxpayers. The other, as the member pointed out fascinatingly in her speech, was the increased revenue that's coming in to the federal government as a result of higher oil and gas prices. Now, I live in a part of the world where we have to burn oil from Saudi Arabia because the coalition decided that they didn't want a pipeline called Energy East. And we also have to burn electricity through Colombian coal in Nova Scotia. That's where we get our energy, Saudi Arabia and Colombian coal, because of the policies of this government. I'd like the member for Calgary Mindapore to please comment on what she thinks about the preference for us to burn energy and oil from places like Saudi Arabia, repressive regimes, compared to clean, ethical Canadian oil.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mid-Nepal.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my Conservative colleague for that question.
Very frankly, I think it shows how little this government thinks of Canadians, that they would turn to nations with dictatorships, that they would turn to nations without regard for human rights, that they would turn to nations without regard for the rule of law before turning to its own citizens and its own resources to fill these needs. It just shows what little respect they have for Canadians, our resources, and frankly, our livelihoods as well, Mr. Speaker. So it's incredibly disappointing to see this historical action from the NDP Liberal government, and I think, Mr. Speaker, we're going to see a lot more of it, given the additional information about this NDP Liberal coalition that was made public this week. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
We have time for one quick question. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Speaker, I guess my shortest question to the member for Calgary Mindapore is to actually ask if she's familiar with the course of the Kinder Morgan pipeline before the National Energy Board, the refusal of the National Energy Board to hear evidence that it would cost jobs and hurt the economy, the National Energy Board rejecting the evidence of Unifor and saying that the NEB was not going to look at the economy or jobs. The proponent from Texas decided it couldn't make money at the project, and they've actually, what a deal. They laughed all the way to the bank in Texas. So I'll just cut it short there and ask if she's familiar with the actual history of the Kinder Morgan pipeline.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mindapore, 20 seconds.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my colleague for that question.
You know, I think there's a very interesting history. At the time I was consul to Dallas, Texas, Mr. Speaker, we actually had an inverse relationship whereby Harper was ready to pass any energy project necessary, while President Obama, who is a known ally of the NDP Liberal coalition, was there to stop every interest for Canada at every step of the way. Those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci beaucoup.